June 5, 1944, 2300 hours. Calais, France. Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann stood atop Battery Tot, the massive concrete fortress overlooking the English Channel. The wind carried salt and diesel fumes across his face as he watched the darkness swallow the horizon. Behind him, the 406mm guns, stolen from the French battleship Provence, pointed toward England like accusing fingers. The metal was cold. The night was quiet. And for 3 years that quietness had been Germany's greatest weapon. He unwrapped a piece of hard rye bread from his ration pouch, the same coarse loaf every soldier in the Wehrmacht had eaten since 1941. It tasted of sawdust and survival. Somewhere below in the bunker's radio room, a crackling voice reported the same message transmitted every night. Lage ruhig. Situation calm. Hartmann bit into the bread and believed it. The Atlantic Wall stretched from Norway to Spain, 400 miles of steel, concrete, and certainty. 5 million mines buried in French sand. 15,000 fortified positions. 500,000 men dug into cliffs and beaches, trained to repel the inevitable invasion everyone knew was coming, but no one truly feared. Because the Atlantic, as far as the German High Command was concerned, was safe. It had been safe since Dunkirk. Safe since the Kriegsmarine choked Britain's supply lines. Safe because crossing it with an invasion force was tactically impossible, logistically suicidal, and strategically insane. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself had walked these beaches in April, hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning the surf. "The enemy must be annihilated before he reaches our main battlefield," he'd written to Berlin. "We must stop him in the water, not only delaying him but destroying him." Rommel ordered more obstacles, wooden stakes called Rommel's asparagus, hammered into tidal flats, steel hedgehogs welded on shorelines, concrete tetrahedrons half submerged in foam. The message was clear. The Atlantic was a moat, and Germany held the castle. But what Rommel and Hartmann and every soldier staring into that black water didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that across the Channel, in English ports from Portsmouth to Plymouth, in Scottish harbors and Irish coves, an armada beyond comprehension was preparing to erase their certainty in a single dawn. The myth of the Atlantic Wall was not built on arrogance alone. It was constructed on 3 years of brutal evidence. After Dunkirk, Britain had retreated behind its island shores, battered and alone. The Luftwaffe had tried to break them in 1940 and failed, but that failure taught Berlin a crucial lesson. Invading Britain was impossible. If Germany, with air superiority and U-boats prowling every shipping lane, couldn't cross the Channel heading west, how could the Allies ever cross it heading east? The mathematics seemed unbreakable. To launch an amphibious invasion, the Allies would need thousands of ships. They would need air cover, which meant constructing airfields or bringing carriers into range of coastal guns. They would need supplies, fuel, ammunition, food, transported across 100 miles of open water while U-boats hunted them. They would need to land men on fortified beaches, under artillery fire, with nowhere to retreat. Every military academy from Sandhurst to West Point taught the same lesson. Amphibious assaults against prepared defenses were bloodbaths. Gallipoli in 1915 had proven that. Dieppe in 1942 had confirmed it. At Dieppe, 6,000 Allied soldiers, mostly Canadian, had stormed the French coast in a raid meant to test German defenses. Within 9 hours, more than half were dead or captured. The beaches ran red. Tanks drowned in the surf. The Luftwaffe strafed landing craft like target practice. When the survivors limped back to England, the lesson seemed carved in stone. The Atlantic Wall worked. German military intelligence, the Abwehr, reinforced this belief with reports estimating that any Allied invasion would require at least 6 months of preparation visible from reconnaissance flights. They would need to mass troops, stage equipment, build embarkation points. The Channel ports, Calais, Boulogne, Le Havre, were the only logical targets because they were the closest to England and had the infrastructure to support a sustained offensive. So Germany fortified Calais most heavily, stationed the strongest divisions there, and waited. Oberleutnant Hartmann ate his dry bread and trusted the wall. He trusted the sea. He trusted that the Allies, despite their industrial might, despite their manpower, despite their fury, could not conjure an invasion fleet from thin air. Physics and strategy agreed. The Atlantic was safe. But what Hartmann didn't see, what no German radar operator or coastal watcher comprehended until it was too late, was that 50 miles south, beyond the range of searchlights and binoculars, the largest invasion force in human history was already moving. June 6, 1944, 200 hours, the English Channel. The water churned black under a moonless sky. No stars, no lights, just the hum of engines, thousands of them, rolling across the darkness like distant thunder that never stopped. If you stood on the deck of any ship in that armada and looked in any direction, you would see shadows. Ships everywhere, destroyers and battleships, landing craft and minesweepers, troopships carrying men who hadn't slept, tankers hauling fuel, hospital ships waiting for the wounded who didn't exist yet. 8,000 vessels, end to end, stretching across the channel in columns so long they seemed to bend with the curvature of the earth. The Allies called it Operation Neptune, the naval component of Operation Overlord, but the soldiers called it something simpler. They called it the Crossing. And as they stood on crowded decks, rifles slung, stomachs tight with fear and seasickness, they gnawed on something the Germans hadn't tasted in years. Fresh white bread. American quartermasters had baked it by the ton. Soft, pale, fluffy, the kind of bread that required wheat fields in Kansas, flour mills in Chicago, bakeries running 3 shifts, and a supply chain spanning an ocean. The kind of bread that symbolized abundance, not survival. Private James Thornton from Ohio held his ration in both hands, felt its softness, and thought about home. He thought about his mother's kitchen, about diners on Main Street, about a country that could feed its soldiers real bread while shipping steel, planes, tanks, and ammunition across 3,000 miles of water. The German soldiers waiting in Normandy bunkers had been eating Kartoffelbrot, potato bread, dense and gray, mixed with sawdust to stretch rations. Their coffee was ersatz, made from acorns. Their fuel was rationed. Their ammunition stockpiles were half what they'd been in 1941. But they didn't know that the men crossing the channel were eating fresh bread, that behind those 8,000 ships stood factories producing a Liberty ship every 42 days, an aircraft every 5 minutes, a tank every hour. They didn't know that America had outproduced the entire Axis combined in 1943 and would do it again in 1944. They thought the Atlantic was a barrier, but to the Allies, the Atlantic was a highway. The deception had been total. For months, British intelligence had orchestrated Operation Fortitude, a phantom army commanded by General George Patton stationed in Kent, directly across from Calais. Inflatable tanks, fake radio chatter, double agents feeding false information. The Germans believed the main invasion would strike Calais because that's where the most obvious evidence pointed. That's where logic dictated. That's where Rommel kept his panzers. But the real target was Normandy. 5 beaches spread across 50 miles, code-named Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The Allies chose them precisely because they were unexpected, lightly defended relative to Calais, and close enough to Cherbourg to capture a deep-water port within weeks. The plan was audacious. Land 156,000 men on the first day, establish a beachhead, then pour in reinforcements faster than Germany could respond. At 300 hours, the minesweepers went first, dragging magnetic sleds through the darkness, clearing corridors for the battleships. Behind them came the bombardment group, American, British, and Canadian warships mounting guns so large they could hurl shells 20 miles inland. At 500 they opened fire. The horizon lit up, orange flashes. thunder rolling across the water, coastal batteries erupted in flame. German observers in forward positions frantically radioed headquarters. Bombardment underway, sector unknown, massive naval activity. But the messages came too slowly. Radio operators confused the locations. Commanders assumed it was a feint, another deep-style raid meant to draw divisions away from Calais. Rommel wasn't even in France. He'd flown to Germany for his wife's birthday, convinced the weather was too poor for an invasion. The man who'd sworn to destroy the Allies in the water was 700 miles away when the water filled with ships. By 600, the first wave hit the beaches. Ramps dropped. Soldiers poured into surf turned red. At Omaha Beach, German machine guns from WN-62 and WN-65 strongpoints tore through the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. Men drowned weighed down by equipment. Medics screamed for morphine they didn't have. The sand churned with bodies. For 2 hours it looked like deep again, a slaughter. But this time the Allies didn't retreat. Because behind the first wave came the second, and the third, and the fourth. 20 waves in total, 156,000 men, supported by 12,000 aircraft dropping paratroopers inland and bombing roads, bridges, and rail lines. The Germans had prepared for an invasion. They hadn't prepared for an avalanche. Oberleutnant Hartmann learned about Normandy at 7:30 hours, when a motorcycle courier arrived at Battery Tot with orders to send reinforcements south. He read the dispatch twice, certain it was a mistake. Large-scale landing operations underway, Con sector, all available units to proceed immediately. He climbed back to the observation platform and looked west. The horizon was empty. The channel was calm. The bread in his pocket had gone cold. Somewhere 60 miles away, his war had already ended. He just didn't know it yet. By nightfall on June 6th, Allied forces held all 5 beaches. The cost had been staggering, over 4,400 confirmed dead, thousands more wounded, but the beachhead was secure. Engineers began unloading supplies directly onto the sand. Sherman tanks rolled inland. Within a week, the Allies would land 326,000 men, 54,000 vehicles, and 104,000 tons of supplies. Within 2 weeks, they'd link the beaches into a single continuous front 50 miles wide. Within a month, they'd capture Cherbourg and turn it into the largest supply port in Europe. The Atlantic Wall, the fortress Germany spent 3 years building, had been bypassed in a single morning. Not because it was poorly designed. Rommel's defenses were brilliant. Not because German soldiers fought poorly, many strongpoints held out for days, but because the Allies had done what the Germans believed impossible. They'd assembled an armada so vast, coordinated an operation so complex, and sustained a logistical effort so immense that no wall could stop it. The soldiers who survived D-Day remembered the bread. Years later, in letters and memoirs, they mentioned it. Not the fear, not the noise, but the bread. Private Thornton wrote to his mother in July 1944, "We had fresh bread on the ships. I don't know how they did it, but we did. And when we got to the beach, there were supply ships right behind us with more. The Germans were eating sawdust, Mom. We were eating bread." It was a small detail, almost trivial in the scale of the invasion. But it represented something larger, something the German high command had failed to calculate. America wasn't just a country at war. It was an industrial empire that could fight on 3 continents simultaneously, while raising the standard of living at home. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States produced 300,000 aircraft, 89,000 tanks, 3 million machine guns, 193,000 artillery pieces, 2,400,000 trucks, and 5,200 ships. And it fed its soldiers fresh bread. Germany, by contrast, was starving, not immediately, not visibly, but slowly, systematically, as the logic of total war ground down reserves. By June 1944, The Wehrmacht relied on horse-drawn wagons for transport because fuel was scarce. Tanks sat idle waiting for gasoline that never arrived. Luftwaffe pilots flew missions knowing they might not have enough fuel to return. The vaunted panzer divisions that had conquered France in 1940 were ghosts of themselves, undermanned, under-equipped, and anchored to defensive positions because there wasn't fuel for maneuver warfare. The soldiers in the Atlantic Wall bunkers had believed their own propaganda. They'd been told the Allies were weak, that American soldiers were soft, that democracy bred inefficiency. They'd been shown newsreels of U-boats sinking convoys, of bombed British cities, of German science producing wonder weapons that would turn the tide. They'd eaten their potato bread and trusted that scarcity was universal, that everyone was suffering, that the war was a test of will. But when the sun rose on June 6th and they saw the horizon black with ships, when naval guns the size of train cars obliterated bunkers they'd thought impregnable, when the sky filled with aircraft painted with Allied stars, they understood. The Atlantic hadn't been safe. It had been a trap, and they'd been the bait. Rommel returned to France on June 6th, driving through chaos. Refugees clogged roads. Paratroopers had cut phone lines. Allied aircraft strafed anything that moved. He reached his headquarters near La Roche-Guyon at midnight and stared at maps illuminated by candlelight, trying to comprehend the scale of the disaster. "We've been outmaneuvered," he told his chief of staff. "They landed where we weren't, and even if we'd been there, I don't think it would have mattered." He was right. The Battle of Normandy would last 2 months, but its outcome was decided in the first 48 hours. Germany couldn't replace the men it lost, couldn't resupply the divisions, couldn't match the firepower pouring onto French soil. By August, the Allies had 1 million men in France. By September, they'd liberated Paris. By December, they were on the German border. The Atlantic Wall crumbled not because it was breached, but because it was irrelevant. The real wall had been the Channel itself, and the Allies had turned it into a highway paved with steel and sustained by an industrial machine that produced abundance where Germany produced only scarcity. Oberleutnant Hartmann surrendered on August 19, 1944, when Canadian forces surrounded Battery Tot. He'd fired his guns twice, once at D-Day +2 when a destroyer strayed into range, once at D-Day +9 in a futile attempt to hit supply convoys. Both times he'd missed. The ammunition had been old, the targeting solutions outdated. The war had moved past him before he'd fired a shot. In the POW camp near Southampton, British guards gave him a sandwich, white bread, butter, tinned beef. It was soft, almost sweet. He ate it slowly, tasting something he hadn't known he'd been missing. Around him, other German officers sat in silence, chewing bread that represented their defeat more clearly than any surrender document. They'd believed the Atlantic was safe because they'd measured safety in guns and concrete. They hadn't accounted for wheat fields in Kansas, steel mills in Pittsburgh, shipyards in Newport News. They hadn't understood that industrial capacity was a weapon more devastating than any panzer division, that logistics could decide battles before soldiers fired a shot, that a country capable of feeding its troops fresh bread while projecting power across an ocean wasn't just winning a war. It was rewriting the rules of what war meant. The 8,000 ships that appeared off Normandy weren't just a fleet. They were proof of a different kind of civilization, one that could mobilize resources on a continental scale, one that could coordinate millions of people toward a single goal without enslaving them, one that valued abundance over ideology, production over propaganda. The German soldiers manning the Atlantic Wall had fought for a vision of strength built on domination, Lebensraum, racial purity, military supremacy. They'd been told this vision was destiny, that Germany's will would overcome material disadvantages. That spirit mattered more than steel. But on June 6th, spirit met steel, and steel won. Not because the Allies fought harder. Many German soldiers fought with desperate courage. But because the Allies fought smarter, supplied better, and represented a system that could sustain total war without consuming itself. The bread mattered because it was a choice. The United States could have rationed more severely, could have forced its citizens into scarcity to maximize war production. But it didn't. It produced both guns and butter, both tanks and bread, proving that democracy and abundance weren't weaknesses, they were force multipliers. Soldiers fought harder knowing their families were safe and fed. Workers produced more knowing their sacrifices weren't permanent. Allies cooperated because they believed in a future beyond victory, a world where the Atlantic was a highway for trade, not a battlefield for empires. 70 years later, historians would debate the turning points of World War II. Stalingrad, Midway, Kursk. But for the soldiers who crossed the Channel on June 6, there was no debate. The war ended the moment 8,000 ships appeared on a horizon the Germans thought was empty. Everything after was just mathematics, the slow, grinding arithmetic of industrial might against ideological delusion. The Atlantic had never been safe. It had been a mirror, reflecting back the truth that totalitarian regimes could build walls and dig bunkers and plant mines, but they couldn't outproduce a free society mobilized for war. They couldn't replace the ships, couldn't match the airlift, couldn't feed their soldiers bread that tasted like home. Oberleutnant Hartmann lived until 1987. He settled in Hamburg, worked as an engineer, raised 3 children. He never spoke much about the war, but sometimes, late at night, he'd remember standing on Battery Tot, eating hard rye bread, watching empty water, believing the Atlantic was safe. And he'd think about the morning the horizon turned black with ships, the morning certainty died, the morning he learned that freedom, properly organized, could cross any ocean, breach any wall, and rewrite any ending. The bread had been soft. The war had been hard. And in the space between those two truths lay the reason 8,000 ships could appear where Germany saw only darkness.